Everyone thinks they know why the Beatles fell apart. Fans have heard the rumors, the tabloid theories, the endless documentaries trying to piece together the truth. But Paul McCartney is finally setting the record straight, and what he reveals is nothing like the stories that have circulated for decades. In a deeply personal interview, he describes the single moment that shattered the band's future and the painful decisions that followed. According to Paul, the real reason behind the split wasn't about rivalry or burnout, but something far more human. And his explanation not only rewrites the ending of the Beatles, it exposes a hidden struggle that changed all of their lives forever, where Paul McCartney's genius truly began. On June 18, 1942, James Paul McCartney entered the world, born to James and Mary McCartney in Liverpool. Looking back on his early life, he often spoke with deep admiration for his parents and the tight-knit community that raised him, calling them the kind of people who grounded him and shaped his character. From the very beginning, music flowed through the McCartney household. Paul's father, a trumpet player and pianist, kept melodies drifting through the home, and young Paul soaked it all in. He had a natural gift, teaching himself piano by ear, joining the local choir, and developing a real love for sound, before he even understood where it would all lead. When he turned 14, his father gave him a shiny nickel-plated trumpet. But as rock and roll began sweeping through Britain, Paul's heart shifted. He wanted to sing, to play, to be part of this new energy. So he traded the trumpet in for a 15-pound Framus Zenith acoustic guitar. The excitement didn't last long, though. Being left-handed made the instrument feel impossible. Every chord felt wrong. Then came the moment that changed everything. He saw a poster of Slim Whitman, a left-handed guitarist, strumming with ease. It was the spark he needed. Paul flipped the strings on his guitar, and just like that, the instrument opened up to him. On that Zenith, he wrote his first song, a gentle tune titled, "I Lost My Little Girl." Around the same time, he played around on the piano and laid the foundation for "When I'm 64," a song that would later become a classic. But talent only grows so far in isolation. He needed people to play with, people who heard music the way he did. In 1954, at just 12 years old, he met someone who would become essential to his journey. While riding the bus, he crossed paths with a young George Harrison. They bonded quickly. Two boys with guitars, big dreams, and no idea what was coming. A couple of years later, when Paul was 15, destiny struck again. At a church fete at St. Peter's, he heard John Lennon and the Quarrymen perform. Their mix of early rock and roll and skiffle grabbed him instantly. Not long after, the Quarrymen invited Paul to join as a rhythm guitarist. Saying yes that day changed the course of his life and music history. John Lennon later described that meeting as the moment everything started moving. Even the location of their meeting, St. Peter's Church, became part of the Beatles' mythology, with a grave in its churchyard inspiring the song Eleanor Rigby. It was a setting where two young musicians unknowingly stepped into greatness. But beneath the excitement, both boys carried a heavy emotional weight. Only a year before meeting Lennon, Paul had lost his mother, Mary, to an embolism following breast cancer surgery. Barry Miles' biography, Paul McCartney, many years from now, offers a heartbreaking look at that period. Mary was a devoted nurse and a loving mother, someone Paul remembered as gentle, comforting, and full of warmth. Her passing shattered the family. Paul's father, Jim, was plunged into deep grief, but with the support of relatives, he found the strength to raise his sons alone. This loss became a defining part of Paul's emotional world. Music became his outlet. After Mary's death, he poured himself into songwriting, spending his spare time mastering the guitar. His first song emerged directly from this period of mourning. He later reflected that even if he hadn't intended it, anyone looking closely could see the connection between his grief and his early compositions. Meeting John felt almost like finding a new family. The boys were inseparable, singing in bathrooms for the Echo, sharing meals, sharing ideas, and building a creative bond that grew deeper with every passing day. Then tragedy hit again, this time on John's side. His mother, Julia, who had always been kind and welcoming to Paul, was struck by a car and killed. Her death happened just a year after Paul and John had met. Suddenly, the two boys weren't just friends and collaborators. They were linked by a profound shared loss. Both had lost mothers too young. Both were trying to find stability in a world that had taken something irreplaceable from them. That shared grief seeped into their songwriting and strengthened their creative connection. Together, they found a way forward, and together they began the journey that would reshape modern music. When Paul's talent suddenly failed. Most people know Paul McCartney as the bass-playing hitmaker of the Beatles, but when he first joined John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, he was actually brought in for something completely different. At that time, Paul was the most technically skilled guitarist in the group. Yes, even more polished than John. Because of that, the band invited him in as their new lead guitarist, while they were shifting from skiffle toward real rock and roll. His first performance with them came on October 18, 1957, at the New Club Moor Hall in Norris Green, Liverpool. It was a big night, what could be called Paul McCartney's unofficial Beatles debut. But the moment didn't go the way anyone expected. Despite all his talent, Paul froze. Nerves hit him hard, and during the Quarrymen's take on Arthur Smith's Guitar Boogie, he botched the solo he had easily mastered in rehearsal. His voice also had a habit of cracking at that age, which didn't help his confidence. Looking back years later, he admitted it wasn't ability that failed him. It was pure stage fright. With everyone staring at the guitarist during those crucial few bars, he simply locked up. That stumble opened the door for George Harrison to join as lead guitarist, a twist that ultimately shaped the Beatles' sound forever. Even the promoter that night, Charlie McBain, seemed uncertain about the band's potential. He scribbled good and bad on their visiting card, an early review that reflected the shaky debut of the nervous newcomer who would later revolutionize modern music from behind a bass guitar. Outside the music, Paul's teenage years were already getting complicated. In 1959, he met his first serious girlfriend, Dorothy Rohn, at the Casbah Club. Beneath the charm, though, their relationship carried a darker side. According to biographer Bob Spitz, Paul had deeply controlling tendencies. He wanted to shape Dorothy into his ideal partner, choosing her clothes, her makeup, even paying for her to style her hair like French actress Brigitte Bardot, a woman he and Lennon idolized. He restricted her from smoking and discouraged her from spending time with friends, rules he never applied to himself. Meanwhile, the band was evolving. By 1960, they'd cycled through names like Johnny and the Moondogs, the Silver Beatles, and the Beatles. Then, just before leaving for their first major residency in Hamburg, they made the choice that would define them forever, the Beatles. Hamburg was a world unlike anything the Liverpool boys had seen. Paul wrote home to Dorothy, but the temptations of the city were stronger than any letter. He later admitted that he had numerous affairs during this period, most with escorts. To him, the women in Hamburg were more experienced, more confident, and unlike the girls back home. But it wasn't just romance that pulled him in. Hamburg was where he first experimented with substances. The band relied heavily on Preludin to power through their exhausting all-night sets, beginning a long and complicated relationship with drugs. The chaos didn't stop there. The Beatles' early months in Hamburg are full of wild stories, and one of the most infamous ended with Paul in jail. After a string of issues, including George Harrison being deported for being too young to play late-night gigs, things came to a head. When Paul and drummer Pete Best were packing in a dark room, they tried to brighten things up by setting a condom on fire and using it as a makeshift lamp. It was meant as a harmless joke, but the club owner, already unhappy after ending their contract, used it against them. He called the police and accused Paul of arson, despite the building being made of non-flammable stone. Paul and Pete spent the night in a German jail and were deported the next morning, joining George back in Liverpool. John Lennon stayed behind with Stu Sutcliffe for another week and a half before returning. Stu remained in Hamburg for love and art school, but tragically died from a brain hemorrhage 2 years later. That first Hamburg residency tested the Beatles in every way, emotionally, creatively, and physically. It hardened them, sharpened them, and pushed them toward the global breakthrough that lay ahead. But for Paul, all the chaos abroad was nothing compared to the challenges waiting for him back home in Liverpool. When Paul McCartney returned to Liverpool after that grueling, eye-opening run in Hamburg, he walked straight into a life-changing moment. His girlfriend, Dorothy Rohn, told him she was pregnant. The news stunned him. He did what many young men in his position would have done. He proposed, and they set a wedding date. For a brief moment, it looked like Paul was settling into a traditional future, one far removed from the chaotic club nights and sleepless gigs he'd just come from. But life took a painful turn. Dorothy suffered a miscarriage before the wedding, and with the pregnancy gone, Paul made a decision that revealed just how conflicted he truly was. He ended the engagement and the relationship only weeks after the loss. Suddenly, he was untethered. No fiancé, no family responsibilities, nothing pulling him away from the band. And with that freedom, the Beatles surged forward. By 1962, everything was falling into place. Ringo Starr had joined as the final missing piece, and the band released their first hit, Love Me Do. A year later, it was everywhere. By 1963, the Lennon-McCartney partnership was a full-blown songwriting engine, powering out tracks like I Saw Her Standing, There and Can't Buy Me Love. Their sound didn't just dominate the UK, it leapt across the Atlantic and started reshaping American pop culture. You'd think being part of a global phenomenon would feel exhausting, almost suffocating. There were punishing tour schedules, wild crowds, frantic escapes from hotels, and constant pressure. But Paul later reflected that for him, this was the dream fully realized. He talked about those early peak years as if he were starring in an electrifying film, swept up in the excitement he'd always wished for. Even the chaos outside packed venues felt like a reward rather than a burden. Still, fame had its downsides. For McCartney, one thing stuck to him harder than he ever wanted, the nickname that followed him for decades, the Cute Beatle. The label irritated him throughout his life. While he was comfortable being associated with his role in the band, he never liked being simplified into some charming heartthrob. He felt the press boxed each member into a caricature, and he ended up with the one he liked the least. In his eyes, he hadn't been cute, certainly not in the way the media painted him. And once that sort of tag sticks, it's almost impossible to shake. But the irritation over nicknames was nothing compared to what was coming. Paul's hidden romance behind the chaos. Now these four sharp-dressed young musicians didn't just play music, they sparked a cultural wildfire so intense it earned its own name, Beatlemania. Picture it for a moment. Crowds of teenage girls screaming, fainting, bursting into tears at the mere sight of them. And right at the center of all that chaos was Paul McCartney, the so-called cute Beatle, the one every girl wanted to claim as her own. But despite the world falling at his feet, Paul's heart was already spoken for. He first crossed paths with Jane Asher in the spring of 1963. Just before a Beatles performance at the Royal Albert Hall, a photographer gathered the band for a photo with the young red-headed actress who'd been sent by Radio Times to cover the event. She was dazzled by the band's charm, but she wasn't the only one doing the admiring. All four Beatles were taken with her, something Paul later confirmed by admitting they all fancied her. Later that evening, after inviting her to their hotel, the only lingering question was which of the four Beatles she preferred. As it turned out, Paul was the lucky one. He walked her home that night and gently asked if she'd like to see him again. Once newspapers caught them leaving the Prince of Wales Theatre together, the secret was out. Overnight, they became one of Britain's most talked-about young couples. Behind the camera flashes and headlines, Paul was genuinely swept off his feet. Cynthia Lennon, John's first wife, summed it up simply. She said Paul fell like a ton of bricks for Jane. To him, she wasn't just glamorous, she was the prize. But as 1963 unfolded and the Beatles exploded into global superstardom, Paul's everyday life evaporated. Suddenly, he and Jane couldn't take a casual walk or slip into a hotel without being mobbed by fans and photographers. Paul needed somewhere quiet, somewhere away from all the noise. The solution ended up being Jane's family home in London. Eventually, he moved into their attic and stayed there for 3 years. His time at 57 Wimpole Street was more than just a retreat. It became one of the most creative periods of his life. Jane's mother, a music teacher, gave him occasional lessons and even taught him how to play the recorder. And tucked away in that attic, Paul found the space to write. Many iconic Beatles songs were born inside that house, especially down in the basement music room. One of the biggest examples is "I Want to Hold Your Hand." Paul and John wrote it in a burst of energy, sitting face to face, feeding off each other's ideas. "Even Yesterday" came from this period. Paul literally woke up with the melody in his head and played it on the piano by his bed before it could slip away. Living with the Ashers also introduced Paul to a different kind of London. He started attending artistic gatherings, mingling with musicians, actors, painters, and thinkers. He soaked up everything he could, always looking for new inspiration to push the Beatles' music into fresh territory. But even with the creative freedom and the warm family environment, Paul and Jane's relationship had its own storms. Jane was determined to build her own career as a serious actress, not just be known as a Beatles girlfriend. She was independent, stubborn, and outspoken, qualities Paul both admired and struggled with. As much as she challenged him, he couldn't imagine his life without her. Things shifted dramatically in 1967 when Jane left for a 5-month acting tour. During her time away, Paul experimented with LSD. He had avoided hallucinogens for a long time, but eventually took his second trip with John Lennon after a Sgt. Pepper recording session. He later claimed the experience opened his eyes and made him a more honest and tolerant person. When Jane came home, she felt like she was returning to someone she barely recognized. Paul and John had bonded in this new, psychedelic world, and she hadn't been a part of any of it. She felt excluded, distant from this new version of Paul. But the gap between them wasn't just about drugs, there were deeper wounds. While Paul loved Jane, he wasn't living like a committed partner. He wasn't married, and he didn't consider his affairs a major moral issue. But with the press following him everywhere, he had to keep these romances quiet. He slipped easily into the glamorous rock star lifestyle. Late-night encounters, groupies, and flings with actresses like Peggy Lipton. Lipton, later a star of the Mod Squad and the future wife of Quincy Jones, claimed Paul once told her he wanted to marry her. And these weren't just whispered rumors. Journalist Ivor Davis, who had toured with the Beatles in 1964, confirmed the secret relationship. All the while, the media continued predicting a wedding between Paul and Jane. On Christmas Day in 1967, those predictions seemed to come true when they announced their engagement. It looked like a fairy tale, but it didn't last. Everything collapsed when Jane unexpectedly returned home one day and found Paul in bed with his new girlfriend, the American writer Francie Schwartz. Heartbroken, she walked out without a word. By the summer of 1968, the 5-year relationship was over. Jane publicly confirmed the breakup on the BBC show D-Time. She admitted the relationship was finished, adding that they still cared for each other and might reconnect someday, perhaps even marry, when they were old. Since that painful moment, Jane Asher has stayed almost completely silent about her years with Paul, leaving their story frozen in time, marked by love, creativity, heartbreak, and the growing pains of fame. The night that changed everything. As the 1960s hit full stride, the Beatles were shifting so quickly, they were barely the same group that had burst onto the scene just a few years earlier. Their sound, their style, even their mindset, everything was evolving. And right at the center of that creative whirlwind was Paul McCartney. He had fallen deep into the avant-garde world, dragging wild concepts and bold experiments back into the studio. He even dabbled in making his own strange, artsy films. Most people point to John Lennon when they think of the psychedelic punch behind Tomorrow Never Knows, but those eerie, otherworldly sounds? Those came straight from Paul, who cooked them up using handmade tape loops that were way ahead of their time. But with Lennon and McCartney, two creative powerhouses in the same room, the friction was inevitable. The tension between them had already started simmering during the Rubber Soul era. Meanwhile, the band as a whole was running on fumes. Constant touring had worn them down to the bone. Paul later said it felt like they were losing their souls, a heavy thing for a group riding the highest wave of fame the world had ever seen. Eventually, by the end of their 1966 US tour, they simply quit performing live forever. Still, Paul wasn't letting go of the artistic spark. He became the engine behind the concept for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, pushing the idea that they should shed the suffocating identity of being the Beatles and reinvent themselves. He believed they were no longer boys bound to the stage, but grown artists who needed room to explore. The album turned into a masterpiece, one of the most celebrated in music history, but it also marked the beginning of the slow unraveling of the band. Then came the blow no one was ready for. In 1967, Brian Epstein, their manager, their steady hand, their father figure, died unexpectedly. The loss cracked the foundation beneath them. Paul stepped into the leadership void, trying to keep the ship afloat, but not everyone appreciated his direction. John Lennon complained that Paul had the band running in circles, and the tension that had been simmering for years exploded into something the group couldn't contain. In the middle of all this chaos, Paul needed refuge, somewhere that felt soft, somewhere he could breathe, and fate handed him exactly that. He had crossed paths with photographer Linda Eastman before, but it was only after Epstein hosted a celebratory dinner for the completion of Sgt. Pepper that's when things shifted. After the dinner, Paul headed to his usual hangout, the Bag O' Nails nightclub in Soho, a spot where he practically had his own seat. Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames were on stage, the room smoky and buzzing, when Linda walked in. She wasn't just another club-goer, she was an American photographer with real credibility and serious access to rock's inner circles. Early in her career, she had hustled her way into a Rolling Stones promo event and ended up the only photographer in the room. By 1968, she became the first woman to shoot a Rolling Stone magazine cover. She wasn't just talented, she was fearless. That night in May 1967, she and Paul finally crossed paths in a way that actually mattered. As she stood up with members of the Animals, Paul caught sight of her and knew he had only a second to act. When she walked past his table, he jumped up and gently blocked her path, offering a shy, charming greeting and an invitation to another club. It was a line he'd never tried before, and he admitted it felt like a gamble, but Linda agreed. What really won her over was when Paul mentioned he owned some original René Magritte paintings. She adored Magritte. That detail sealed the night, and soon enough, she was back at his place, staying until the next morning. The timing wasn't right for anything serious, not yet. Paul was still with Jane Asher, and even though the spark between him and Linda was real, it had to wait. But once Paul and Jane's engagement ended, he found himself thinking back to Linda more than anyone else. She kept coming to mind, standing out from all the women he'd ever known. By September 1968, he finally acted on those feelings and called her. His message was simple: get on a plane and come to London. She did, and everything fell into place. The following month, right after the White Album wrapped, Paul flew to New York to stay with Linda. There he bonded with her young daughter Heather, and found a rare kind of peace. He grew a beard, slipped into anonymity, and walked around New York like a regular guy, riding subways and exploring the city without cameras in his face. It was the closest he'd come to feeling human in years. By the end of 1968, Paul knew with certainty that Linda wasn't just a partner, she was home. And during a trip to Portugal, he asked her to marry him. Paul and Linda Eastman married in the spring of 1969, and the day carried the kind of atmosphere only a Beatles event could create. Rain was pouring, the sky was gray, yet crowds of devoted fans still packed the steps outside the Marylebone Registry office just to catch a glimpse of them. Even when Paul tried to keep things private, the world still showed up. There was a small hiccup right at the start. Paul's brother, Mike McCartney, was meant to be the best man, but the train he was on from Birmingham broke down, leaving him scrambling to get there. When he finally arrived, he and the Beatles' loyal assistant Mal Evans served as witnesses. Linda's young daughter, Heather, stood close by, already part of this new family being formed. What most people don't know is how close the entire wedding came to falling apart. Just hours before the ceremony, Paul and Linda got into a massive argument, so intense that calling off the wedding was a real possibility. Paul later admitted how turbulent they were back then, nothing like the polished image people would eventually paint of their marriage. He described them as a couple, right in the middle of the white water, fighting, reconciling, and somehow still believing in each other. The miracle wasn't that they looked perfect, it was that they stuck together through every messy moment. The ceremony itself stayed simple and intimate. Linda was already 4 months pregnant, and both she and Paul wanted something quiet and grounded. Still, There was one noticeable absence. Not a single Beatle attended. This wasn't an accident. Paul deliberately didn't invite them. Years later, he explained that by that point, the band wasn't a unified group anymore. They were all frustrated, exhausted, and moving in different directions. The brotherhood that had once defined them had already begun to fracture. As if the year wasn't eventful enough, Paul found himself at the center of a bizarre global phenomenon soon after. Rumors began spreading that he had died in a 1966 car crash and had been replaced with a look-alike. Fans dove deep into album covers and lyrics, hunting for hidden messages and supposed clues. The theory spiraled until Paul stepped forward to calm everything down. He posed for Life magazine with Linda, newborn Mary, and Heather, offering a simple reassurance through the cover line. Paul is still with us. That moment finally broke the fever of the conspiracy. But while the public breathed a sigh of relief, something far more devastating was unfolding behind the scenes. The Beatles were reaching their breaking point. Creative clashes, personal tensions, and exhaustion from years of pressure had finally worn them down. In April of 1970, Paul became the one to say it out loud. He was leaving the band. The announcement sent shockwaves around the world, but privately, it pushed him into a deep depression. The group that had shaped his entire identity was gone, and he felt adrift, unsure of what came next. That's when Linda stepped in with real strength. She became the steady grounding force he needed, helping him slowly rebuild himself and chart a new direction. In the wake of the Beatles' breakup, when Paul felt lost and isolated, Linda helped guide him toward the next chapter of his life. After decades, Paul McCartney exposes the real reason the Beatles broke up. Paul McCartney has finally opened up about who he believes was truly responsible for the breakup of the Beatles. And he didn't hold back. In an episode of the BBC Radio 4 series This Cultural Life, he made it clear that he wasn't the one who pulled the plug. According to him, the moment everything shifted came when John Lennon walked into a room and announced he was leaving the band. For Paul, that was the real beginning of the end, and one of the toughest chapters of his life. He explained that he genuinely wanted the Beatles to keep going. In his eyes, they were still creating strong music, still pushing boundaries, still very much alive creatively. This wasn't just a band to him, it was his work, his passion, his whole world. So watching it crumble felt personal. There had always been whispers that Paul was the one who caused the split, but he pushed back on that narrative hard. From his perspective, John made the decision, and the rest of them, Paul, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison, were left trying to figure out what came next. Paul even believed the band could have lasted far longer than their 8-year run if John had stayed. Digging deeper, he talked about what might have driven John to walk away. John was building a new life with Yoko Ono and reaching for a sense of freedom he never really had growing up under his strict Aunt Mimi. Paul felt like John had been trying to break free from expectations his whole life, and leaving the band was part of that journey. Then came the part that still surprises people. Paul actually had to sue his own bandmates after the split. It wasn't out of spite. It was a move to protect their music rights from their then-manager, Alan Klein. Paul described it as a fight he never wanted, but felt he had no choice but to take on. And in a twist that says a lot about their bond, he revealed that the other Beatles eventually thanked him for stepping in. Decades later, the emotional weight of it all still lingers. John Lennon's tragic murder in New York City in 1980 cut short any possibility of reconciliation or reunion. But on what would have been John's 81st birthday in October 2021, Paul shared a heartfelt throwback photo of them rehearsing together, a quiet reminder of the partnership that changed music forever.